What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Cosmic Wonder. I'm your host, Warren Thompson, and we just watched Loki, episode 3. And there is so much to digest and break down in this one episode alone. We are going to do this over a few different videos, but starting with this video, we want to talk about how OB could actually be a villain, but Victor Timely could actually be good. OB being a villain is actually a theory that has been going on since the very first episode. And now it looks like things are tying together that does seemingly point towards that theory that OB could be a villain still working for He Who Remains. In fact, he could be the key in helping He Who Remains return. However, he needs Victor Timely in order to do it. Now, you might be thinking, but He Who Remains is dead. And yes, he is, but keep in mind, in the comics, Kang has the ability to transfer his consciousness into other different variants. And he did this using his own technology in the comics. So it wasn't like a supernatural process that Kang used or a power that he tapped into. He simply built the technology that enabled him to do that. He would switch his consciousness, transfer his mind to an alternate body right as he died. And let's not forget the last thing he said to Sylvie before he died in the season finale of Loki. He said, "See you soon." Now, some people think that he was simply talking about his variants, and of course that would make sense, but what if he wasn't? What if he was literally meaning he himself would see Sylvie too, because he would be returning? Some insiders have stated that He Who Remains is going to indeed show up in Loki season 2, and some insiders have even thrown out the name He Who Returns. And this episode made it very clear that He Who Remains had a plan. And we have a good theory of what this plan could actually be, and it involves OB. In this episode, we meet Victor Timely, a variant of Nathaniel Richards, who was the original Kang the Conqueror. Now, keep in mind, this is not the same origin that He Who Remains had. He Who Remains was not Victor Timely, who was given a TVA book. Remember the season finale of Loki, where He Who Remains explained all of the different variants, the multiversal war, and basically his origin. I truly do believe that Victor Timely is a good variant. Here's why, and here's why their origins are completely different. Remember what He Who Remains said. He said eons ago in the 31st century. So keep that in mind. Even though it was forever ago for He Who Remains, it was still in the future to us, to the main MCU timeline. The 31st century is the 3000s. So He Who Remains' origin started in the late 2900s and the early 3000s. So definitely not 1868. Plus remember, He Who Remains said when describing the origin that this was before the TVA. So his origin was before the TVA had even been built into existence yet. Now that is obviously very different for Victor Timely. Obviously the TVA exists if somebody, Renslayer, gave him a TVA handbook. And in this version of Victor Timely's life on this different timeline, he doesn't create the TVA, not directly. So his origin is very different than He Who Remains and probably a lot of the other Kangs out there. But it doesn't come as that big of a surprise because this is the multiverse. Not only can variants of one person exist in a different universe, but they can exist at a different time. And that's what we are experiencing here. But He Who Remains had a very specific plan. He told Miss Minutes and then Renslayer to deliver the TVA guidebook to this specific Kang variant, Victor Timely, in 1868. Now, why would he do that, and what is his plan? Well, I believe his plan is simply to return, and I believe that OB is helping him do that, of course, along with Miss Minutes. Renslayer is kind of kept in the dark at this point in time, but we do know, thanks to earlier episodes, that she was basically a high commander for him in the multiversal war. So I'm sure she'll play some type of part in He Who Remains' return. However, right now, there is kind of one thing holding up this plan, keeping it from happening, and that is the possible destruction of the TVA and everyone inside of it, including OB. And He Who Remains already built the TVA. He doesn't want to have to do it again, probably. For whatever reason that hopefully will be revealed if this is accurate, He Who Remains needed to ditch the body and the position that he was in and get into a new one. Now, we know that in the comics, Kang isn't really immortal. There's only one version of Kang that is immortal, and that is granted to him. He is not naturally immortal. He is a human. Yes, his suit and technology do allow him to live longer, but he isn't immortal. So perhaps he simply just needed a new body to continue to reign. everything. But in order to get a new body, he would need a new variant of himself. And in order to get a new variant of himself, the sacred timeline had to split. It had to essentially turn into the multiverse. That would mean that everything that happened in the finale of Loki season 1 was planned, which makes sense because we're talking about He Who Remains here, the person who built the TVA, who has been essentially writing time. You know this person has a plan, and everything that he does is intentional. And we know that he led Loki and Sylvie to him. So now the multiverse exists again. It's not just one universe, not just one timeline. So variants of him exist now, ones that he could transfer his consciousness into. And it looks like he picked a variant that isn't really a main Kang. We've seen the other main Kangs. We've seen Immortus. We have seen Rama Tut, the Scarlet Centurion. We've seen Skrull that are Kang. Victor Timely is very different. It's almost like he's just a body for He Who Remains to take over. And who right now is helping preserve the multiverse? OB. OB is making sure that the time loom can actually handle all of the different strands of time. He said many times already that he needs to basically retrofit a device that can keep the time loom intact to be able to handle all of these different timelines. So basically he needs to expand its capacity is what he said. So OB is literally helping keep the multiverse intact, because if it was simply just one universe, then only one Kang would exist. And keep in mind, the timeline started to branch and the multiverse started to be formed before He Who Remains was killed. Remember, He Who Remains suddenly felt the multiverse began to exist again. He said, "So I fibbed. I don't know what's going to happen next." And as he said this, the timeline started to branch. So Victor Timely could have existed before he died. That way, when he did die, he could transfer his consciousness to him eventually. Or he could have transferred it to another person. However, they specifically need Victor Timely because one, he's not a very advanced Kang. In fact, he isn't Kang at all. He is simply Victor Timely. And this is not a Victor Timely who was Nathaniel Richards before, was Rama Tut before, was the Scarlet Centurion, and then did go back to Earth at some point in time and became Victor Timely. That is not how it is. That's how it was in the comics, but not how it is in this new MCU story. In this story, Victor Timely was born Victor Timely, and he didn't invent anything without the help of one of his other variants. He Who Remains giving him the TVA handbook. However, this was specific, I think, because he exists in a time where the technology he needs to create everything just isn't there, and he even says that in this episode. So he gives him just enough to make him know what the TVA is and create some sort of a device that could help OB when he gets to the TVA. This episode was really about Victor Timely going back to his home and grabbing that one specific device. And what if this was specifically He Who Remains' plan? He Who Remains transferred his consciousness into a different variant, but then had Miss Minutes and Ravonna Renslayer give Victor Timely the TVA handbook so he could create a specific device, so he would eventually go back at this very point in time in the TVA when it's about to explode, then give that device to OB. He fixes the time loom so it can handle the capacity of all of the different time streams, and then bam, the real He Who Remains can return later on in the future. He could take Victor Timely, however, I think his consciousness would have already been transferred at this point in time. I do believe Victor Timely is good. Sure, he may be a little bit of a scammer, selling prototypes to people that don't necessarily work, but we know that he's not a conqueror, and he showed many signs of being a good person. In fact, in the scene where he sold the temporal loom, there was the one man who tried to buy it from him, but he was outbid. That man then went to the bar and he put his hat on the bar, and after Victor Timely had sold the device, he went over to that man and gave him some money. Secretly, he put it under his hat. He gave him a little pat on the shoulder, showing that he was sorry and he felt bad for him. I don't think this is Kang the Conqueror at all. We know that variants can be completely different from each other. Look at Sylvie and Loki. So I think Victor Timely is good, and I think he could be, eventually, a really good ally for Loki and Mobius. And as far as OB being a villain, I've heard some theories that he could be a Kang variant. However, I don't think this is necessarily true, because if that were true, his temporal aura would work for the TVA, but it doesn't. That's why they need Victor Timely. However, I do believe that He Who Remains is getting the help from OB, because remember, OB wrote the TVA guidebook, but He Who Remains created the TVA. So He Who Remains and OB had to be very, very close. And OB probably played a massive role in helping create the TVA and, of course, maintain it over these eons. So I'm betting that He Who Remains, if he had a plan, asked OB to help. And OB, since he's known him for so long and knows him to be the creator of the TVA and has helped him throughout this entire process, well, I'm sure OB is going to take his side. But that is just my theory on this. Let me know, what do you think about this? Do you think OB is bad? Do you think Victor Timely is good? Let us know all of your thoughts and your theories in the comments down below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the latest news. Also, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment, because then you're automatically entered in our giveaway for a chance to win a PS5, an Xbox Series X, some Marvel Legends items, and some DC items as well. The winner gets to pick one item, and we pick one winner at the end of each month. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter, and as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.